So let's bring it up to the modern day, okay? Now, let's just remember this. We have a thirsty model of civilization which begins to go out from Europe to America, then to the east and around the world. And what it does is it requires great drafts of water in order to feed industry and, most importantly, to begin to feed agriculture, because a new form of agriculture was being moved around the world. Initially, if you like, the cotton irrigation fields of India and Pakistan put in place by the British Empire in order to grow cotton for factories in England, but they leave a huge legacy. This idea of industrial agriculture, the idea that native peoples on lands can be moved off, the idea that water will always flow to your whim, these become set in our model of civilization. And so we come to the modern day. Peak water. Peak oil we kind of get, don't we? That if we get to a certain point where we've sucked up so much oil, there'll just be less underground than we had at the outset, and we've taken most of it. Peak water doesn't seem to make much sense. After all, there's always water. I mean, go outside, it's soaking wet. So how do we get peak water? Well, you get peak water like this. If you're Scottish and lucky, and you have all this amazing amount of water on the surface rushing towards you, you don't really need to bother with wells. But if you live in a less rainy place, a slightly drier place, the likelihood is a lot of your water is going to be coming from underground. Ancient stores of water, just like oil in the sense it's there, it can be pumped up. And the great thing about a water well as opposed to an oil well is that actually it will replenish. If you don't take it out too fast, the rain will put stuff back in. Water wells should be able to keep us all going forevermore. But when the great thirsty civilization machine rolled in and started pumping up, it pumped too fast for the rain to replenish. Let me give you some examples of this. There's a fantastic report out from Amnesty International this week about the water situation in Palestine. Now, Gaza is on top of the coastal aquifer. An aquifer is a water well, again, just like an oil well. You pump it up too fast, it will go. So the coastal aquifer underneath Gaza has been pumped up too fast because the occupied territories have no other choice. They have no other source of water. But the result of this is that the well empties. When it empties, in this particular case, if you're butt up against the Mediterranean Ocean, salt water seeps in and ruins it for you. So Gaza is a perfect example of somewhere which has hit a long time ago peak water, pulling out more than it can cope with, to the point that, unless there's some major political and hydrological change in that region, it will cease to function, certainly within our lifetimes, and possibly alarmingly soon. It's kind of hard to gauge. It, again, depends on other factors. But peak water is also occurring in other places of the world. Peak water is occurring in central India, where they're desperately pumping it up, using diesel pumps to get that water out to grow food in order to play catch-up with Western standards of the economy. And who can blame them? I certainly wouldn't. But the consequence of that is this: there won't be water underground forevermore. And the same is happening in China. We've asked them to make our stuff and to do our dirty work, but actually they've got to do it using water beneath them. And the consequences of this is that the water footprint of you and I, our reach of water, when you consider that Loch Lomond is out there, untouched, but for folk who can afford motorboats, but we are sucking up the water underneath China in order that it can make our stuff and grow our stuff and then ship it back to us. So our thirst isn't national, it's international. The West has got its lips to the cup of the world's water and is drinking it down. And that is one of the reasons why we have peak water, as well as the fact that other nations quite reasonably want to play catch-up, as well as the fact that we have now given the world crops and industrial processes which simply require huge drafts of water. So here's the thing. There's going to be peak water. It's not going to happen right in Scotland, but we are going to feel it because we're going to start losing the things that are grown and made elsewhere in the world. And here's the thing also, that water goes into everything. If you imagine Grangemouth Refinery, it's like a kind of magic sorcerer's workshop of the world where oil gets divvied up into all sorts of component parts and ends up in everything, our drugs, our food, our clothes. Well, water does that 10 times over. There's not a thing, an individual item in this room which hasn't either used water in its manufacture, has water impacted in it, or relied on water to be grown. So, let us go back to our beginning. We have a choice. We can all die in a war, and if we do, then that means you, sir, are going to be in a very bad position. Would you like to come back with me? Because our poor lone man sitting on his great loch of water is going to discover that the rest of you would quite like it. So here's the decision. Who wants to have the gun? Do you want it?
Probably not.
No? Well, that's a nice, noble thing. There is actually a tradition, oddly, about northern wet nations being terribly liberal about this and generous about this. The Swedes and the Canadians, they're absolutely at the forefront of trying to think about the water problem. We're less so, but it would be a good thing if we caught up on that. But yeah, you're absolutely typical. You are a Canadian or a Swede. You're looking for a rational answer. Best of luck with that.
Yeah.
The rest of you, would you like the gun? Because the water's running out. You're not going to be able to plant your food. You're not going to be able to make your stuff. Your economy isn't going to function to the desired standard that you've been aiming for. So what are you going to do?
People will fight for water.
You will fight for it.
Well, some people also go and will fight for water.
Yeah. Any other ideas for how we might, what might happen?
Change how we live, to use less water.
Absolutely. So that's one way to go. Yes, sir. You could. Have you seen the property prices in Edinburgh? But exactly. Now, all of these things are true. We might either get our war, and people might fight for it. And I would tell you, I would argue right now that people are already fighting for it. If you try and privatize water in areas of South America or Central America, there have been fights to the death. Not with tanks and missiles, not with diplomats, but hand to hand for a tap. If you go to the Sudan right now, there is a civil war raging and is expected to sort of flare up again, according to some folk I've been talking to, partly because the water is distributed so unevenly. If you go, as I say, to the occupied territories, in my opinion, Amnesty International is absolutely right. Water is being used as a tool of war. It is being deliberately denied and or restricted in order to control the way people move, develop, and live. So the war has started, and I think that it's going to be that kind of war. I think the 60,000 tanks which currently sit in depots across Europe are useless, and we should forget thinking of that as our next great war. Our next great war will be a general degradation of living standards for people in major regions of the world. And yes, you, madam, are absolutely spot on. I think you're right there too. We are going to have to change what we mean, what it means to be civilized. That this thirsty, wet civilization doesn't work. And we're going to have to accept that to live in different places around the world, we will have to live differently. And we will possibly also have to find ways of trading water, perhaps a bit like we trade carbon. But this is a kind of wide open area, which I'm happy to discuss. Or people are going to move. And people are already moving. So we already have water migrants. Again, some of the examples I've already cited. And that's going to get worse. And maybe you would stay on your bit of land to fend for your farm, but your daughters and your sons might think, why were we doing this? This is a miserable struggle when we could go next door and there's water there. And they might move. I don't know. One of the lovely, glorious things about water as an issue is it's still there to be defined. It isn't like oil. It isn't obvious that there will be a war. It is up to us, all of us, right now, we can begin to define this issue, how we get out of this problem. My job with Peak Water was merely to say, there really is a problem. And the problem is how we live and how we've chosen to live. And the problem may appear to be regional, but it will affect us all. And the glorious, lovely thing about this is that if we crack how to share water and use water better, we crack so many other problems with it. We crack people's futures and their hopes and their dreams. And in water, we can change the world.